Hello. Today I'm going to be discussing with you the ideas of toxic masculinity, where it stems from, and how differing demographics may alter opinions on toxic masculinity. I've heard so many contrasting opinions about masculinity and toxic masculinity, but have never understood the separation of the two or completely understood the premises of the two. I wanted to explore the dimensions of masculinity to see how hypermasculine media and politics have influenced gender stereotypes. As I began researching, I found that a lot of people did not understand that there was a difference between being masculine and possessing toxically masculine traits. I originally thought that to be a toxically masculine man was to essentially be incredibly sexist. However, as I researched, I began to understand that this confusion may come from what Michael Salter calls a catch-all definition for what it means to be a man. That is, we have one definition that we have created that is supposed to conform a large proportion of society. Salter argues that in creating this catch-all, we have made an environment that sustains and maybe even promotes toxic masculinity. This catch-all definition for both manliness and toxic masculinity muddles distinctions in between the two and causes people to see masculinity as predominantly toxic. To first understand toxic masculinity, it helps to understand the creation of it. The phrase toxic masculinity was coined during the mythopoetic men's movement of the 1980s and 1990s. The mythopoetic men's movement essentially was based on two texts, Iron John by Robert Bly and Kind Warrior Magician Lover by Robert Moore and Douglas Gillette. Ideas of the movement noted that feminism inadvertently created too much force on femininity in society. Apparently, the feminist movement of this time brought too much femininity into men's lives and disrupted their identities. Ideas of toxic masculinity have essentially been based around the same premises ever since. However, these ideas were not brought under such scrutiny until the 21st century. The separation of masculinity and toxic masculinity proves to be important when understanding specifically why toxic masculinity has been under question. We know that masculinity exists as a real biological attribute, for example, having testosterone. Toxic masculinity, on the other hand, creates actions to reinforce the premise of manliness. In no way does masculinity have the intent of being harmful. Contrastingly, toxic masculinity takes alleged traits of being manly and attributes it to culture in a way that has the potential to be harmful. In an article written by my hometown paper in Washington State, the author reflects on Leonard Sax's novel, The Lost Boys of America. This article notes that the boys of the 21st century have become entirely unmotivated and underachieving. The author notes that if America's future wants a chance at success, they should focus on raising their sons with more drive. I compared this to an article by Taylor Mooney of CNN who discusses the term man box. A man box describes the socialization of men put into a box per se with specific traits, one of which being underachieving. Boys who underachieve in school seem to be primarily interested in activities like video games and sports, specifically at a mid-teen age. Through having a lack of drive towards education, it seems that boys have an increasing exposure to hypermasculinity portrayed through the media, which in turn may facilitate the growth of toxically masculine tendencies. Just as with everything today, modern media has created unrealistic expectations for men. Fictional movies and video games promote many hypermasculine messages in media. The majority of male protagonists in games and movies aimed at teenage boys are characterized as being directly oppositional to women. Desirable features are in no way linked to emotion and are mainly based off of strength and violent capacities. Although the characteristics of these protagonists are over-exaggerated, they promote an underlying message that actions and behaviors of men must uphold a specific definition. For example, take Call of Duty. The game was undoubtedly created and advertised predominantly for men. Violence and chaos pollute the game. Protagonists are unrealistically muscular, tall, and strong. Some argue that the violence portrayed in games similar to Call of Duty may be linked to real-world aggression in boys. Subconscious violence may progress as these games are normalized, showing men that instead of being emotional, they could in turn use violence for cathartic release. This leads to the normalization of misogynistic hate crimes, attack on the feminist movement, and the increase of power relationships. As I begin to dive into societal influences on men more, I kept coming to the conclusion that although pressures and unrealistic expectations inevitably are a driving force in hypermasculine behavior, toxic masculinity is predominantly linked to one thing: fear. What this fear is directed towards is different for every man, but it seems that most of the time, fear is outwardly manifested as hypermasculine behavior. To link this back to previously discussed topics, it could be said that boys who seem underachieving may take fear of academic failure and channel it into sports or video games where they can express their emotions physically. Or take locker room talk, for example. Jared Yates of the New York Times argues that locker room talk in the office or on the field all stems from the fear of being less bodied than competitors. Fear is unique to everyone's experience, male or female. However, it seems that the way men express this fear results in actions that in most cases come across as toxic masculinity. Gillette razors sparked a movement aiming to call men to be the best version of themselves. Calling to action the Me Too movement and bullying, Gillette highlights the importance of responsibility and the power of positive action.
Bullying. The Me Too movement against sexual harassment. Masculinity.
Is this the best a man can get? Is it? We can't hide from it.
Sexual harassment is taking over.
It's been going on far too long. We can't laugh it off.
Who's the daddy? What I actually think she's trying to say.
Making the same old excuses.
Boys will be boys. Boys will be boys. Boys will be boys.
But something finally changed.
Allegations regarding sexual assault and sexual harassment.
But she says you don't tell me.
And there will be no going back. Because we believe in the best in men.
Smile, sweetie. Come on.
To say the right thing. To act the right way.
Bro, not cool. Not cool.
Some already are. In ways big
Yo, men.
and small.
I am strong.
But some is not enough.
It's not how we treat each other, okay?
Okay.
Because the boys watching today will be the men of tomorrow.
So, this ad was created to promote the idea that men have a right to their emotions and a right to their personal manliness. However, challengers to the commercial thought differently. After the ad was released, comments on the video were largely negative, stating that Gillette was releasing feminist propaganda. Big-name Gillette supporters, such as Piers Morgan, felt their manliness was attacked by the commercial and withdrew their support from the razor company. "Let boys be damn boys, let men be damn men," says Morgan. Piers Morgan, along with other Republican men's rights activists, find toxic masculinity to be emasculating. These men find that when activists highlight hypermasculine behaviors, they are aiming to spread the message that all men are evil people, all toxic with their masculinity. Republican radio personality Rush Limbaugh poses a similar argument on spreading awareness of toxically masculine behavior. Limbaugh's main point is that feminists are taking manliness as bullying and rude, twisting it into their own ideas of toxic masculinity. As the feminist movement calls for men to be held accountable for their actions, Limbaugh argues that this devalues everything that manliness has stood for in the past, creating the wussification of America. When comparing demographics, major Republican politicians in general have seemed to majorly reject the ideas of toxic masculinity. Take our Republican President Trump, for example, who uses ad hominem fallacies to play into this fear in men and provoke a reaction, which in turn only fuels the behaviors of toxic masculinity. Or rather, consider Fox News. In a sarcastic expose on the war against men, Laura Ingraham states, "Toxic masculinity has infected almost every area of our culture. Dismissing and demonizing the contributions of men throughout history has become inspiring. On the other hand, Democrat Obama called to women to get more involved, stating that men have been, quote, getting on his nerves, handling business through violence and bullying. Democrats similar to Elizabeth Warren or Obama have spread awareness towards toxic masculinity, bringing its effects into light. It seems that in the political sense, demographics play a huge role in opinions surrounding toxic masculinity. In a study conducted by Munch and Gries, 42 male college students were asked specific questions pertaining to their masculinity. The study found that underlying tones of stereotypical masculinity defined almost all of the students' ideals of manhood. Their ideals were similar to men's ideals portrayed in hypermasculine video games and TV shows, as discussed earlier. Although these men showed to have complex understandings and respect for women, they still found it important to be in control of conversations and to be the breadwinner or primary source of income in a relationship. I wanted to see how male college students in my life would react to similar questions, so I decided to conduct a similar study. I asked 23 college-age boys from my hometown who go to college across the United States 6 different questions. 1. Who was the primary breadwinner in your house growing up? 2. What sports did you play growing up? 3. What does man up or be a man mean? 4. What are the qualities of a good man? 5. What does toxic masculinity mean to you? And 6. What is healthy masculinity? From my study, I found surprisingly that the boys I conducted the study on had relatively similar answers to the college students in the first study. When asked, what does man up or be a man mean to you? I found my results were all relatively similar. Answers like toughen up, or grow a pair, or mama didn't raise no bitch permeated basically every answer. When asked to explain the qualities of a good man, kindness, honesty, generosity were all common. Additionally, strength, the ability to care for your loved ones, and athleticism were equally present. Similar to the men in the original study, qualities like strength and athleticism were important qualities for these men to possess, rather than emotional stability. When asked what toxic masculinity was, most men answered that with responses similar to manipulating people or always wanting to be dominant. I found this to be interesting when compared to the previous question discussed, or what the qualities of a good man were. These men were able to note that to be toxically masculine was to desire the typical gendered power control, but still considered their ability to protect and be strong important in their definition of being a good man. Similar to the original study I conducted, I can assume that the boys' question in my study acknowledged the difference between masculinity and toxic masculinity, but still have residing notions of hypermasculinity in their definitions of what it means to be a man. I found that demographics did not really have an effect on the outcome. The form was sent to boys aging from 18 to 24, attending schools from Georgia to Washington to Colorado. This may be because mostly all of the boys did grow up in the same hometown, but current location and political standing did not seem to have an influence on the results. Linked back to the previous fear discussed, Jared Yates argues that above all, fear in the feminist movement is what drives toxic masculinity. Based off of my study, I do not agree with this. I think that fear is the driving factor towards toxic masculinity, but what that fear is derived from is personal to each man. The modern man is able to understand femininity and show respect for it, but this is not to say that they do not have hypermasculine tendencies and thoughts in the back of their head. Linked back to the socialization of boys to be put in a box, images of manliness continue to be permeated by unrealistic expectations of manhood. It is not to say that to be a man is automatically toxic, but rather how each man chooses to present their manliness that has a tendency to seem toxic. Toxic masculinity is not the result of societal influences or pressures on gender stereotypes. It exists on a scale that is specific to each man. So, what can we do to combat the increasing issue of toxic masculinity? To bring awareness to the negative influences toxic masculinity has on growing boys, we need to normalize conversations about masculinity. It should not be something that's controversial, but rather something that is widely accepted and appreciated across all forums. When we allow ourselves to have multidimensional conversations about gender, we will allow a society where men in particular do not feel the need to conform to this man box and can be free from the pressures of society. Thank you.